In the presence of a quorum, I call this meeting of the Acton Finance Committee to order. The town of Acton, in response to the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, is currently following the guidance from the Acton Board of Health, Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and the CDC regarding the virus and steps communities can take to prevent the spread. Thus, we are meeting virtually. If you are attending from a computer, you can click on the link on our agenda, which is posted on the town website, or from a telephone, dial 646-876-9923 and enter webinar ID 976-1599-8775. Telephone users may dial *9 to request to speak after joining the meeting. Computer and app users may use the raise hand feature to request to speak. I'm just going to say that I've promoted David Martin to a panelist position after a discussion we had, because it makes it easier, as if when we were meeting in the room live, if he had input that was helpful to our discussion for clarifying of facts, he could raise his hand, we could see it, and we could offer to let him add information. And so this is just going to be an easier way for me to do that while we're still meeting on Zoom. But otherwise, he's just going to appear on your screen. Video off. Okay, first item on the agenda is public participation. Do any members of the public wish to speak? I don't see any hands raised on the attendees list, so I am going to go ahead and move us to our first item, which is the only item really, which is the FY23 school budget discussion. And I'm going to go ahead and bring in Dave Verdolino and Marie Altieri and Peter Light. And hopefully I accomplished that. Good evening.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Marie. All right, I see John Peterson and Amy Krishnamurthy on the attendees list, but you're the three that we're going to hear from tonight. Is that accurate? Okay, great. Then Dave, if you're all set, I'm going to let you kind of bring the committee up to speed on the current state of the coming budget discussion.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Welcome, welcome, Dave. Hello, everybody. If you have paid attention to the last couple of school committee meetings, a lot of this will sound familiar to you, but what I'm intending to do is to give a brief overview of the process we followed to date to construct the FY23 budget. Peter has presented twice to school committee. This presentation is essentially the highlights of those presentations and would form a basis for your questions for us. Call your attention as a reminder to the budget workshop, formerly known as Budget Saturday, which will be on Thursday, February 17th at a regular school committee meeting. There'll be a lot more presented relative to budget information, a lot more in-depth material then. However, if we, myself or Peter or Marie, who are all here, can answer any questions tonight, great. Alternatively, we'll take the feedback from this meeting and include in presented material at the workshop. This year's budget process has been challenging. From my view, it's been the most difficult since I've been at AB. This is my 5th year. But I do appreciate the opportunity to present to you and hopefully solve some of these challenges that we're facing. So I am going to ask if I just click share screen, Christine, will that work?
As far as I know, it should. It should let you pick what to share.
Everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
And it should be bigger now, maybe? Okay.
No.
So this is tonight's presentation, and as I said, well, I didn't say this, but we're going to be presenting this material to Boxborough Finance Committee as well next week. As I did say, this is one of 2 presentations that Peter made, the first on January 13th. That was less than 3 weeks ago. And to a little bit of my chagrin, there are still moving parts. So this is not ready yet for development of the budget binder material that will accompany the presentation on the 17th. Here, I'm not
sorry,
going to say.
Could I break in for a second?
Yes.
Could you please put it into slide view mode or something, make the slide fill the whole screen? It's hard to see.
Hit F5. Hit F5.
You're telling me to hit F5?
No, him.
Okay, thank you.
That should
All right,
do it.
him did it. Now, what am I going to do to advance the slide?
Well, it didn't change for us.
It didn't?
No.
Oh, it did for me.
That's exciting. When you to advance the slide, you
Yeah,
would hit
just
like
hit down arrow. Yeah.
yeah. So can
But you gotta
stop the
you
share
got-
for a second and then start it again, and that should fix it and give us
Okay.
that.
you gotta share on the presentation view, not the speaker notes view.
Got it. How's that?
Much
Ooh,
better.
yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. And let's see if this works. There. So I'm not going to spend time going through every slide in detail. If you have any questions, please stop me if you have to raise your hand to get Christine's attention. However it is, if I hear background noise, I'll stop talking and we'll go from there. This is the budget schedule. You probably know or have seen this, but just to kind of summarize it, and we're right about in the middle. The regional agreement calls for us to back up our final school committee vote and our preliminary school committee vote from the earlier of the two town meetings, which this year is Boxborough's on May 9th. So you back it up to the school committee vote on the 17th and the preliminary vote on February 17th. This is a hypothetical slide. So when we embarked on the budget development, we targeted an operating budget increase of 3.5%, which would have resulted in about $3.5 million new dollars to the budget. Unfortunately, because of declines in revenues and reserves in total, we're not able to have any budget growth funded by those two sources, by the combination of new revenues and budgeted use of reserves at that time. And so taking that target budget increase, knowing that we had less in reserves and revenues to apply to it to defray those costs, we were looking at a preliminary total assessment of a little over 4.5%. It's obvious to me because I deal with these things all the time, but because revenues plus reserves plus assessments funds the appropriation, if revenues and reserves are down, then in order to hit that appropriation, the assessment has to increase. So with that preliminary target for our budget, we began the budget development process. The departments, the 20 departments in the district prepare budget requests. They came in at an aggregate of about $4.7 million increase. As seen in the previous slide, revenues and reserves is projected at a decrease. We identified additional commitments that the school committee had authorized in the past that were not included in the departmental budgets, and we need to fund them. And we identified what we called non-negotiable cost increases. So you say, well, if it's a non-negotiable cost increase, why is it a minus here? It's because some of the departmental budgets had anticipated a steeper increase than was needed. And so we were able to back off the request by $134,000. If you've seen Peter's presentation, You know the details for these. I won't go into them here. And then before proceeding with the presentation, we identified some urgent budgetary needs. And I'll just quickly discuss that if you think that's helpful.
Sure. And Dave, somebody does have a question on this slide.
Excellent. That'll let me find my
I'll give you a
place.
second, right?
Yeah.
So, Jason, go ahead.
This may not be appropriate at this point in the presentation. It might be better to hold until the end. I don't want to jump in, but just to say on the previous slide, actually, you had said that your initial target was 3.5%. I believe that our own FinCom point of view for the last 5+ years has been to target a 3% increase. I'm curious why the discrepancy between the FinCom ALG recommendation and your own internal initial target.
I think it's probably an appropriate question now, Jason, because once we leave the target and start dealing with actual numbers, this will be lost. But we knew going in that it was going to be an extremely difficult budget year because we got very early guidance from the Health Insurance Trust that they intended to. They gave us a preliminary indication that they were looking at a 10% rate increase. A 10% rate increase for the district is a little over 1% on the entire budget. That means everything else would have been restricted to, from your standpoint, 2%. We didn't think that was feasible. And so internally, we adopted a target to get to 3.5%. If we hit that target, I guess I'd maintain that we could have done some work to reduce it, to get it down below. But as you'll see, or as you have seen, we're not at 3.5%. We're a bit north of that. But that's
I understand that. I just want to preserve the prerogative that in the future we still continue to say 3% should be the target.
Got it.
Can I just add a little bit to Dave's thinking on that too? I think the other thing that we knew internally as a district is that the the revolving account, particularly in community education for extended day and ComEd programs, was extremely low due to some of the losses of the pandemic. They lost about $2 million over the course of the pandemic. And we have been funding custodial and electricity costs and utility costs at a relatively significant level through that budget. And we knew that through this operating budget, we'd have to bring those costs back into the operating budget out of the revolving funds to keep that program solvent. So that was another kind of driver in our initial thinking around what was going to be realistic in this budget.
Thank you. That actually prompts a question I'm going to hold until a future topic of conversation.
Okay. So I talked about additional funding and just really, it was 4 items: the need for an English language educator, a literacy coach at one of the elementary schools, some early literacy resources, and an increase in special ed coordinating services to a 1.0 FTE in 2 schools. Those were identified as necessary and had not been included in the departmental request. They were all staffing requests, and so during the collaborative process, we felt a need for that. If you're interested, I know Peter discussed that at the budget hearing. I won't try to explain them, the educational need for them, but those were identified as needs. And so, given the starting point and our target assessment increase, with the departmental budget requests, with the decrease in revenues and reserves, with the additional expenses for funding prior commitments, the additional expenses for funding urgent needs, And the ironic decrease when we factored in non-negotiable costs, we ended up about $1.8 million over our target. Follow? And so we embarked on a process of trying to reduce that to get us back to as close as we could get, we'll just say, to the target. Actually, we closed the entire gap from a spending basis, but because some of it, as you'll see, was done via reserves, it didn't get the appropriation quite down to 3.5. So these are the reductions that were developed in the budget process. I'm not going to go through them. The three at the bottom, level 1, level 2, level 3 reductions, those were all presented by Peter at the school committee meeting. And you can see the maintain level use of E&D. We had thought it was a really good idea to become less dependent on reserves. Reserves had grown steadily over the last couple of years to $1,245,000. In the ALG model, from what I prepare for projecting school department budgets, I had put in a reduction of $185,000 annually to get us down systematically to a $500,000 level from $1.2 million. So the initial pass of the budget planned for $1.06 million use of E&D. This proposed reduction, and reduction is in spending, in this case not the budget, added back and level funded the use of E&D.
Okay, and I just wanted to clarify real quick, Dave, when you started talking about it, you said reserves, but you actually mean E&D, not reserves, right?
Broad category reserves, but specifically E&D, correct.
Right, but you're not talking about spending all of the school's reserves down to, 500,000. Okay. No. As a matter of fact, so if you misunderstood, I'll clarify. My goal was over I think it was a 5-year period, to reduce the annual use of reserve of E&D in the budget setting process to 500,000 from $1.2 million. It's going to take a while to get us back down to that level, and so the 185 initially planned for FY23 was just step one. Got it. Jason has a question.
That prompts the question that I'm sure is on the mind of other members of the committee as well. What is your current E&D percentage? And if you use the amount that you project in this current budget, where would your E&D percentage be at the end of next year, knowing that you had a 5% upper limit and a recommended 3% lower, a hard and fast, unbreakable 5% upper limit and a recommended lower limit of 3%?
Well, so I can categorically say that we won't test the upper limit. So E&D has not yet been certified for July 2021. I don't know what the problem is. I've been in touch with our rep from the DOR who said that it was getting near the top of her pile. I can tell you that my estimate of where we should come out in July 2021 is about 3.2%. What will this use of E&D be July 2022? Can't tell that until we know all the factors, meaning how many expenditures that are turned back, revenue surplus, all of that. But from a strict dollar standpoint, percentage standpoint, we're 3.2 as of July 2021, subject to any adjustments that DOR makes.
We understand and respect that. We're just curious if the amount in the current budget, the amount in the current ALG plan is going to jeopardize the floor of 3%. It sounds like it probably does.
It might. I mean, $1,200,000, we're still, as we a year ago and for a couple more years, we're hovering around the 100 million mark. So the math is going to be easy. $1,200,000 is about 1.2%. To the extent we don't replenish, we don't turn back in the aggregate $1,200,000. Yeah, we'll eat into the dollar value of 3.2 million from July 2021. But it remains to be seen.
Understood. Thank you.
Yep. So these are the cuts that were proposed in what we called level 1. There was a rubric for determining the leveling among the members of the senior leadership team. That's all you need to know about that. Why something a level 1 versus 2 versus 3? They were considered the most appropriate to move forward with. And so those are the reductions, the first wave of reductions, or the second wave of reductions. And again, you have seen these. Peter has presented these. I'm just pausing and talking a little bit so you can read them for yourself. And another set of reductions, which we called level 3. And level 3 includes the middle one there. We had initially included a reduction in all-day kindergarten tuition per the school committee's 5-year plan to reduce tuition from $3,750 per student to $3,000 per student, and that was in the numbers that we've seen a few minutes ago. What this reduction does is says, nope, we're not going to reduce tuition. We're going to maintain it at $3,750, and the effect of that is to remove $180,000 from the budget requirement. So over probably close to $1.8 million of cuts, which included on a net basis 14.5 FTEs. Now, some of them, the 6.0 classroom assistants is an estimate of FTE, but the certified and full-time staff is a +3 and a -11.5. So 8.5 full-time positions down, 14.5 total positions down.
Dave, just for clarity's sake, there's an attendee with their hand up, and I'm not going to call on them. They're from CPAC, and I'm going to guess that they want clarification that these are proposed cuts and that the special educator position these cuts have not been finalized, right? These have been presented to the school committee, and they are being considered as
That's
ways
correct.
to close the budget gap.
That's correct. The numbers that you see here, everything that we have here has been presented to the school committee, and all of those reductions, additions, transfers of use of E&D, et cetera, will be in the final number that I tell you today. Now, when I say final, it's final for purposes of this discussion. It's by no means final from the school committee standpoint. They're meeting this Thursday, and to continue deliberation on, as you'll see, there are a couple of items that the school committee is going to be asked to weigh in on at this Thursday's meeting as far as continuing with the budget development. And so after these reductions, again, we targeted 3.5. We came in at 3.69. We got down to 3.5%. And then the current speaker realized that the $185,000 restoration of E&D was an assessment decrease, but not a budget decrease. And so you can see there's about 0.19% that did not get reduced from the budget request, but it did get reduced from the assessment calculation. And these result in numbers, as you see, the total assessment 4.6, Acton 4.36, Foxborough 5.8%. That's where things stand as of now. And here's pictorially just the initial departmental requests and the superintendent's preliminary numbers, and that's where we are at this point. At the end of, and remember now, we're still in the January 13th presentation, Peter presented to the school committee a need for feedback and guidance on those, particularly those three categories. Are we using an appropriate level of reserve? What are we going to do about all-day K tuition? And what is the impact on the communities relative to the assessments? And so that's where it ended at the January 13th meeting. 2 weeks later, Peter presented again, and version 2 of the preliminary budget, he discussed the feedback that he had received from the school committee and from the community. And again, I'll talk a little slow so you can see there are some of the bullets are the same between the school committee and the community, and there's a few more things that the school committee knew about and suggested that be looked into in order to proceed. And so when it says topics for discussion tonight, this was on January 27th. Peter wanted some input on the proposed change in eliminating the position of assistant superintendent for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He wanted some input as to relative to the reduction of a special educator, discussion about other funding, and all-day K, and we'll just briefly talk about the scenarios. So when the school committee further discussed on the 27th, this was the other, I said, funding or revenue to support changes. I believe you should know that the rules relative to use of ARPA funds changed, and so we proposed an additional use of ARPA funds to help replenish the community ed revolving accounts. This was key. You wouldn't think this had budget implications, but by replenishing the community ed revolving fund, we're able to continue having community ed subsidize some of the operating costs of the budget, where it was not going to happen without these ARPA funds. And so,
can I just jump in on that for 1 second?
Yep.
Just to go back. And Dave, I invite you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I just want to offer a couple of points on it. Can you go back to the slide before? So, the original ARPA requests from the district were proposed under the interim final rule that had been issued by the federal government around the use of ARPA funds. And as you recall, the money flows to the towns. It was not a school-specific grant program. And so in order, originally under the interim rule, for schools to qualify, a regional district would have to be a sub-grantee of the town. And so when we propose uses of ARPA funds, we had to fit them into the existing ARPA categories. And we were not eligible for revenue replacement at that point. So the major change, I think that from our understanding at least, was when the final rule was applied, or whether it was the final rule, I'm not sure, but when that rule got applied, that really freed up a town's entire pot up to the first $10 million that was allocated to be revenue replacement, which then means that the district, as a sub-grantee, can also similarly have a broader use of those funds. And so one of the things in the original proposal, because we were fitting into pre-existing categories of ARPA, we had not considered revenue replacement, even though that all along has been our top priority, was revenue replacement to get to those, depleted revolving accounts in particular, as well as some of the pandemic-related costs. So this $311 isn't new requests for funds. It's a recategorization of the existing amount that we requested for a different use, so that it could actually replenish those revolving accounts and then positively impact our budget. Dave, is that a fair summary of that?
oh, it's spot on.
So originally you asked for 2.6 million from the town, and you were allocated $1 million plus another, or $1.5 million plus another 500,000 for later. And this would be an additional
No,
ask, or this would be just a different way of allocating those ARPA
no,
funds?
Christine, that's why Peter jumped in, is because this 311 is included in the original 2.6.
Okay.
But it's just, it flows to us in such a way that it could have budget relief implications.
Okay. And then go ahead, Jason, ask your question.
So just a couple of minutes ago, you said that there was actually a $2 million change, $2 million shortfall in the community education revolving fund. Of the $2 million shortfall in the ComEd revolving fund, how much of that is reflected in this $311,000 recategorization, and or how much more of it do you feel could theoretically be appropriately reimbursed by ARPA funds?
I'll start, and Peter and or Marie can chime in if needed. The $2 million is not something that ARPA or ESSER or anything else is going to replenish. Fortunately for the district, the community ed programs, and by those I mean the regular adult ed program, the use of facilities, and the extended day program, they had healthy fund balances pre-COVID. The $2 million was lost as a result of shutting down in 2020, but continuing to pay the staff. In the summer of 2020, not running what's typically a lucrative money-making program and popular program. In school year 2021, tentatively bringing back programs and offerings and having less staff to pay, but having significantly less revenue because people weren't coming back. People weren't allowed to come back for a while. And then when buildings were opened and COVID protections notwithstanding, people were allowed back in the building. They're still not back yet to the level they were. So it should be, while the program's lost upwards of $2 million during the pandemic, we're not looking to restore all of that. What we're looking to do is to get us back to the point where they are solvent and then back to making money, which is a place they were at before the pandemic. This is a bridge, and we're hopeful that whether it's this summer or next summer at the latest, that they resume what would be considered more normal operations, both operationally and economically, and we should be out of the woods. They may have a smaller fund balance, not as healthy as it was pre-COVID. It may take them 10 years to build it back up to that level, if that's what's desired, if that's what's appropriate. But this is to not have to assume costs in the operating budget that had previously been charged off to the community ed funds.
Okay. Steve, go ahead.
So Dave and Peter, I'm just trying to understand the 311,000. So I heard you say it was the revenue replacement was in the original ask of 2.6, but you didn't get the 2.6. Nobody, maybe somebody on the list, nobody got everything they asked for on the ARPA list. So my question is, is it now additional to the $1.5 million, I think I saw over 22 or 23, that is included for you on the ARPA list? So are we talking about $1.8 million over the 2 years, or are we still talking about $1.5 million somehow recharacterized?
Yeah, we're not talking about more money. So again, instead of having to utilize the town's ARPA money prospectively on specific categories of COVID-related costs, the change in the final rule rule allows us to recoup that as revenue replacement. It's a much broader category. It doesn't require us to tie it to anything relative to COVID. We can simply identify what costs we want the funds to be applied to, and so in this case, it would be applied to costs of the community ed program. The 311 is a bit tough to figure without knowing what I know, which is that's two pieces that happen to total up to 311,000, but they were costs that were in the budget development that the school department was going to assume from community ed when we thought that the ARPA money was not going to be allowed to be used by them. When the rule changed and the ARPA rules relaxed and revenue replacement is appropriate for use of those funds, then we believe we can use 311 to solve an expense problem. On the revenue side, it's earmarking these 311,000 for that purpose.
A follow up, if I could, Christine.
Please.
So to try and put it as simply as I possibly can, you were going to absorb $311,000 in costs from community ed, and if you can get recharacterize your opera money, you won't have to do that. So the budget will be impacted favorably by $311,000.
The budget will, two things, Steve. The budget will be impacted favorably because we needed it. And two, the community ed program will still get some relief to help restore their fund balance. It's not like their operation is dire this year as well because they're still not returned to normal. This past summer, they did not have their normal cadre of programs available. And so this is to take the pressure off the community ed family of programs while at the same time providing the budgetary relief we need to do some of these other, to make some of these other changes.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask Dave, so in your original request for ARPA funds, I'm sure you had an idea of what everything would be allocated for use. You looked at what could be covered by ARPA and came up with the 2.6 million, and then you were given the 1.5 million. If you recast 311 of it, what does that take away from? Are there other COVID-related expenses that then aren't covered?
No, this was always intended to be for community ed. But again, initially, we were told that what we were going to have to do was to set up an elaborate program whereby families with financial hardships would apply for waivers, both of the community ed program and the extended day program, and the revenue would come into that program that otherwise would not. So in other words, families would be unable economically to afford to participate in the programs. Now through these waivers offered through ARPA, through the town, they'd be able to do it. It was all going to be on the come, so to speak, going forward and not address the existing fund balance issue.
Got it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, great. Adam, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, David. I apologize if you already went over
Mike,
this,
can you
but
just mute so we can hear Adam? Thanks. Sorry, go ahead, Adam.
What was the balance of the ComEd revolving account pre-COVID? What is the balance of that ComEd revolving account now? And if you could just briefly describe sort of the burn ratio that they're going through at the moment, since their revenue still has not come back, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I don't have the data off the top of my head, but I can tell I alluded to what caused the burn. From March 2020 forward, they essentially had the same costs because the extended day program continued to pay their school employees. We continued to pay them, but we had zero revenue because from March 16th on, nobody was allowed in the school. The summer program that year was not held. And so a lucrative program financially was not able to run. When we returned to school in the following year, which en masse wasn't until April, there was the hybrid program did have kids coming back in September, but the extended day program took a tremendous hit because for 1/3 of the students whose families had them participate remotely from the get-go, and then the others who were in hybrid, there wasn't the need for extended day because the kids were home. And so it was a supply and demand issue of that it wasn't needed, and that was a tremendous loss. They actually lost more money in 2021 because we operated for 9 months. We operated for 9 school months and a summer in fiscal 20. Fiscal 20's numbers don't look too bad by comparison, but fiscal 21 is when the bottom fell out because we still continued to have need to pay staff. The full-time administrators of the programs needed to be paid. We had staff because we ran programs, but they weren't done at a favorable economy of scale.
So their total loss on that operation was 311. Is that correct?
The 311 doesn't relate to ComEd. The 311 is 2 pieces of cost that had been, I gotta get this right, that had been cut from the operating, or added back to the operating budget because we thought, given the ARPA rules, that the ComEd program was not going to be able to afford those subsidies. By relaxing the ARPA rules, now those 2 pieces can go back to community ed, and the 311 is the operating budgetary relief.
So it isn't specifically correlative to how much ComEd lost out of their revolving account.
The 311 is not.
Right, ComEd lost a lot more.
There are other
right?
pieces that play as well. There are several cost centers that were removed from community ed in development of their FY23 projection and put into the operating budget. And 2 things one is not community ed, but in a related process, we had a staff member charged to the pre-K revolving fund that we've brought back into the operating fund budget. We have several fractional FTEs of staff in the finance department and the HR department in the district that had been charged for years to community ed to the tune of, I think it's about $60,000. Both of those pieces, the 50 plus the 60, came back into the school department personnel budget and are reflected in the personnel initial budget request. So there's moving pieces that are separate from this $311,000. But what the 311 did was let's see if I can make this clear.
Dave, can I just jump in for 1 second?
Sure.
And I don't have the exact number in front of me, but how much total did the ComEd revolving accounts lose between extended day and community education? Was it 2 million? And then
I think it was a little less than 2 million. I think it was somewhat less than 2 million.
What do you think? The 311 represents maybe somewhere between 11 and 13% maybe of the total loss. Got
Could be
10 to 12, 11 to 13, it's
could be, but the 311 is intended to be applied to FY23, so 1 year. The loss, the fund balance loss, was over a 20-month period, and so it's a bit of apples and oranges. I can tell you, for what it's worth, where the 311 came from. It was 2 pieces that coincidentally totaled 311. When we let's see, let me just look ahead here.
I think I can help.
Yeah, why don't you jump in, Marie?
Go ahead.
Sure. So the ComEd fund balance went from, let's say, between 2.5 to 3 million. That was the fund balance, to around 500,000 to 1 million. So there's some
Oh no, Marie, you're cutting out again.
But one of the things that happens with community education is they pay for custodians. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. We missed a
Thank
little
you.
chunk, but the important
Sorry.
bit I think you're going to get to is that this is custodians and maintenance that community ed
Custodians and
uncovered.
utilities
Utilities, sorry.
are used during the extended day program. So we have roughly 500,000 in the budget for custodians and utilities. And so in this sort of tight budget, we said, let's move 311 back into the operating budget, because we now know that we can use the ARPA money for some of this. We were able to move that back out if we can use ARP money. So the 311 covers the cost of custodians and a little bit of utilities that otherwise ComEd would have paid for. What it does not do is restore the fund balance that
Right.
went down by $2 million. So there's still a little bit of risk there, and we're wondering what the right balance is around ARP money to sort of mitigate the risk. But at a minimum of the budget increase we had, 311,000 of it was due to moving custodians and utilities back into the operating budget.
And that's an important point that I regret not leading with, is this 311 plus the other pieces that I just talked about that we had already brought back into the budget. Those don't restore the fund balance. Those hopefully restore the solvency of the operation going forward. So this is a fix for FY23 to allow, hopefully, the program to tread water, to not further deplenish its fund balance. And for what it's worth, the 311 was to do two things. So as you'll see, and Peter will be discussing on Thursday, based on the feedback from the school committee and community, Peter is going to propose adding back a position for DEI services, not an assistant superintendent, but another lower level position. And because again of the feedback that tuition for all day K is a burden on families, should be a priority, to tennis in a tennis match, put the $180,000 back into the budget as a tuition break. So restoring the tuition cut from $3,750 to $3,000. Those two things together coincidentally added up to $312,000 that are being added back into the budget. There were two pieces of the community ed subsidy that coincidentally added up to $311,000. We decided it's for our own internal work papers to just leave it at that, and so there's a net of a $1,000 change. But that's what it is. We didn't go about and try and throw a dart to find the right number of ARPA money to use to restore community ed. It was pragmatic as a funding source for these two things that Peter is recommending or proposing to put back into the budget. Peter, did I summarize that accurately?
Yeah, I think so. I think, the 311 isn't necessarily the most relevant of all the numbers. What it really was doing was just trying to see what we needed to offset based on the feedback we received from our school committee and community about things that they wanted to preserve in the operating budget, how we could possibly fund those.
Thank you. Okay, Jason, go ahead.
Thank you. I wrote down my question. If the $311,000 is just for this fiscal year, because of our Are you anticipating making subsequent requests for at least the next fiscal year, since ARPA is a three-plus year project, depending
Yes.
on how things shake out for this current year?
Yes,
Dave, can I take that one?
Yep.
So, we had only a few days to kind of look at the ARPA budget in advance of this school committee meeting because the changes were so late in the final rule. But we have been working on a revised ARPA budget based on, increased flexibility. And so we're going to kind of present a new revised ARPA budget this Thursday to school committee that actually kind of delineates what we think it should look like over 3 years.
And have you given the select board, since they are the primary grantee of the ARPA funds, have you given them a sneak peek of what you're planning?
In all honesty, I think from a process standpoint, I think we probably need to get our school committee feedback first and then submit that over to the town for their purview and feedback as well. Just because we want to make sure that our school committee has an opportunity to have input since they're kind of the governing body for the schools.
It's potentially a chicken and egg problem. I can respect that.
Okay. Dave, did you have more to present?
Just this one. So the next steps from the January 27th meeting and what are expected to be discussed at the meeting this week is relative to should we move forward with a director of DEI position and restore that cost back into the budget, which the numbers which is in there at this point. Should we go through with administration's proposal to reduce special ed teaching positions by 1 FTE or not? That has not been added back. So that cut is reflected in the numbers that I showed you previously. And what to do about all-day K tuition. And so where we stand now, the numbers that on which the budget is based are based on a $3,000 tuition for next year.
Okay.
And then for the budget workshop on the 17th, this is kind of Dave's homework. It'll be a lot of the usual stuff as you see. We'll update the numbers, provide a budget status, compare our expenditures versus comparable communities, look at reserves, the historical trend for reserves and where we stand. Hopefully DOR will have certified E&D by that point. Enrollment and FTE by positions, including SPED, where there's a position that we had identified could be reduced in the budget. The ARPA request, we've just talked about that. What's the budget impact, not just on 23, but potentially years after that? And thoughts about the school committee direction. So what they come up with at this week's meeting may not be anything that I've mentioned to you so far tonight. And so the budget preparation, the budget binder preparation basically begins Friday, the morning after this Thursday's meeting, and the rest of the information there. So that's coming attraction for the budget workshop.
And Dave, just before you're done, can you just talk briefly? There was, I think, a little bit of a late shift in the assessments that we were projecting based on actual enrollment versus projected enrollment.
So yeah, and this is on me as well. So I don't update the assessment calculation on an hourly basis, to say the least. So the numbers that I had been projecting in just doing a rough pass of how the budget increase, how the budget request would impact Acton's and Boxborough's assessments, was based on a projected enrollment from last year. When the enrollment information was received and we got the information from NESDEC, our consultant, Boxborough's reduction was bigger than had been planned. And so as a proportion, Boxborough's proportion of students was a bit smaller than had been anticipated by me in the projection. What that does, students is dollars, less students, less dollars. And so Boxpro's percentage, which we had initially pegged at about 8%, is now, based on these numbers, down to, I think it was 5.8%. And because Acton's share of the pie is bigger, the impact is not as great on Acton. But I think we went from 4% on the dot to where it is now, 4.36.
Okay, I'm going to take Christy.
I remember discussion around reduction in all day K tuition with the goal of bringing it down to being zero would then allow the school to qualify for funding. Do we still stand? And I'm sorry, please correct all this. I think we needed to have that set up in advance. We needed to be down to zero before that could kick in. Where are we on that track? Is that even still a possibility going forward?
It is a possibility. Back in 2020, when the Student Opportunity Act was passed, I actually did a pretty detailed model, and I projected that it would be something that could benefit significantly the district in 3 to 5 years. There was an underlying error in my calculation, and that was that enrollment would be stable. Enrollment was not stable the last couple of years, and enrollment declined pretty significantly. And so, very quick tutorial, Chapter 70 aid is based on the number of students that are served in the district times a rate. When there are fewer students, the rate is down. And I won't go into all the details, but what I will tell you is, because with the release of the governor's budget last week, we got significantly closer to a point where Chapter 70 might benefit the district financially more than the $30 a student, which is all we've gotten. All we've gotten is minimum aid since full regionalization. We would have to have stabilizing enrollment, and it's possible. Again, I don't want to go into the weeds with it, but the second half of what you just said, Christy, is true, that once it is of potential benefit to the district to receive Chapter 70 money, it would, in order to have all-day kindergarten paid for by the state, in other words, included in the foundation budget, tuition would have had to have been eliminated the year before. So there's a 1-year lag. It is not likely that next year is the year, but the year after could. The workings of the numbers reverse themselves pretty significantly with this last budget, mostly due to the fact that inflation was the inflation adjustment used was the highest number that it can be under the law.
That was my other question. What is that number, the inflation number?
The real inflation number, I believe, was about 6, but they're allowed to cap it at 4.5.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. What was the, how many special ed students did you lose in the district? And also, how many special ed teachers does that impact?
How many special ed students did we lose?
Yes.
You're talking about the proposal to cut a special ed teacher?
Yeah, why would you cut the special ed teachers if you didn't lose special ed students?
I'll just do a real quick entree, and then Peter or Marie can finish up. But we looked at the caseloads of the special ed staff, primarily in the elementary school buildings, and there were some that were identified as being very low. I can't explain as to the reason why they were low, but in a tough budgetary time, it was seen as something that we wouldn't be putting ourselves at risk by reducing the staff by one, given those low caseload numbers.
And
You
I'm
didn't-
happy
you
to jump in
didn't
on that,
understand.
Dave. Mike, I could fill in a little bit about special education in general, if that's okay.
Sure.
Special education over the last few years is actually an area that we've tried to put a lot of thought into as a district. And one of the things we saw the need for as a school district was to develop programs that could allow our students to stay in our schools as opposed to having to go out of district. So you will see part of the licensed staff increase that we've seen over the last few years, even as enrollment has declined a little, has been dedicated to actually building out programs in our schools for special education students. I cannot tell you that this correlates to a one-to-one, but the one bright spot in all of our budget projections was actually in out-of-district tuitions, which came in at a savings of about $750,000. As I said, I can't scientifically correlate them. I don't know anyone in the world who could. But certainly, we have a program at Blanchard that I believe has 27 students in it who all could very well be out-of-district placements. And each of those placements can cost, in excess of $90,000 up to $150,000. So, there's a moral side to why we build out programs to help kids stay in district. But there's also an economic side that when you can provide programs and have a cohort of students that's large enough to make it economically feasible, you actually create some efficiencies for yourself and save out of district tuition costs. So, what I think we saw after, special ed student needs come and go on an annual basis. And so we looked hard at the needs of all of our students and the size of the caseloads that our educators had. And we did find a couple places in the district that we thought, we know that there's a place where we probably have to add a teacher to a program because there's increased students, so we'll have to shift someone there. But we also thought there was a place where we could create an efficiency and actually reduce one special education teacher. So, our goal with the school committee was to be really transparent about that and make sure that they knew what our caseloads looked like. And propose that reduction. But, we've received input from them and also from the community that that's really not a palatable change at this point. So we're in the process of incorporating that cost into the budget, and that will go back to school committee.
Okay, so basically you're also saying that there's not a significant change in the population. I mean, up or down a little, but nothing earthly.
No, we have definitely, I want to be transparent. We have seen a decline in our overall student population, and we've also seen a decline in the number of students in special education. And the decline in the number of students in special education is just slightly larger than the overall student population decline. So, I want to be transparent about that and make sure you have the accurate facts. But, I think one thing we have seen is coming out of the pandemic, the highest level of demand of all of our students, and I know our CPAC has talked to this, is on our special educators because just of the general needs of kids. And I think when we think about who was impacted proportionally by the pandemic and shutdowns, students with IEPs and with disabilities were far more disproportionately impacted in significant ways than all of our general education students, just by virtue of need and the fact that there were periods of time where the district may or may not have been able to provide services to kids. So a lot of the work, this year and even this year is, we thought would kind of be a more normal year, but it's been incredibly disrupted again with staffing issues, coming and going. But I think looking forward into next year, we're still anticipating a really high need in our special education population. We recognize there may be some opportunities for efficiency, but we also want to be very cautious about that because if we aren't providing a high quality of service, not only does it harm students more significantly if they have an IEP, but it can also create liability for the district.
Thank you. Isha, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if you could drill down into the reasons for the decline in enrollment, whether it was pandemic specific, you think, or this is just a long-term trend. If you could expand on that. Thank you.
Sure. Marie, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. We do not believe that it was pandemic related. We projected that there would be a decline in enrollment. Birth rates are down in both Acton and Boxborough and across the state. In fact, we're not dropping as much as a lot of the state, but we have had some decline in enrollment, mostly due to decline in birth rates.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jason, you had your hand up, but now I don't see you.
I was going to ask for the school district to give a quick primer on the circuit breaker to members of the finance committee who may not have had kids in the school district recently.
Happy to do that.
Go ahead, Dave.
Someday, Jason, over coffee, you can tell me what that has to do with having kids in the school district, but that's okay. School circuit breaker is a state grant program which subsidizes the cost of high cost out of district students or high cost special needs students. It's typically 75% of the cost in excess of a floor amount. So if give you a couple of examples. If you have a student who costs $40,000 either in district or out of district, that's less than the floor the district has to pay for those costs. If another student costs $150,000, let's say, the floor is about $50,000. That first 50 is the district's responsibility. The incremental 100, the state would pay 75% or 75,000 of that. On top of that, for this current year is the first year that, pursuant to the Student Opportunity Act, the circuit breaker program is also beginning to phase in reimbursement for transportation costs associated with those high-cost special needs students. So you could see that in the budget presented by Governor Baker, there's a lot more money being allocated to circuit breaker. And so the initial reaction might be, okay, that's great. What's Acton Boxborough's share of that additional money? It's not an entitlement. It's not an allocation. The reimbursement is based on cost summaries student by student. If we had more high cost students, we'd get more circuit breaker funds back, but we would have paid more money up front. And so getting a lot of money back in circuit breaker is a good thing, but it means you spent a lot of money on the tuitions, on the special ed costs in the first place. Was that helpful, Jason?
I understand entirely. I wanted the rest of the community to hear it, and I can save the price of a cup of coffee. I hope it's very clear to you why the circuit breaker conversation in relationship to Compass is a very salient description of why the two programs are interrelated and therefore important.
Yeah. Mike and Isha, you both have your hands up, but I think it's from your previous question. So
No, I actually have a follow-up.
okay, excellent. Go ahead, Isha.
So I don't know if I'm maybe premature in asking this question, but speaking to the reduction of the DEIC position, I was wondering if you were planning to present options I understand that there is a lot of support to actually keep the DIC position. I was wondering if there was any consideration to maybe retaining the position, but not at the assistant superintendent level, but maybe at a lower level. If you could speak to that.
Absolutely. Isha, I can speak to that. So that's exactly what we did present, and that's what we're holding in the budget at this point. We were able to, we talked about kind of what's the difference between an assistant superintendent and someone who might be at a director level position. There's probably about a $40,000 savings, 30, 40, somewhere in that range, depending on credentials and experience and everything. Cost savings to go to directorship. But it also, the way I described kind of the difference between an assistant or deputy superintendent and a director typically focuses in an area, whereas an assistant superintendent has to by nature be a generalist because, in addition to kind of overseeing multiple program areas, they also are kind of that last line of, I call it defense before the superintendent. So they're typically fielding a lot of different issues that come into the district, as Marie can attest to.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Can I ask, so you have a certain available pool of ARPA funds that maybe you made a list and you have it, but I haven't seen it and I haven't looked for it, so I'm going to just ask you about it. Is there a reason? Are the things on that list not in this budget? Is there a reason more ARPA funds aren't applicable to this budget? Is this budget simply general operating? And so it's really not COVID losses that you can identify and use ARPA funds for?
No, there are additional ARPA funds, and some of them were included in the original request, and some are kind of new and shifting ideas based on the flexibility afforded to us. Some of the ones that survived the original request were things that focused on kind of equity focused services or social emotional needs or pandemic recovery functions. And then some of the new, I think, are probably more in that revenue replacement category and looking for opportunities, to offset budget costs that aren't necessarily, the thing we're trying to navigate is how to not necessarily offset staffing kind of costs that are recurring, but offset some of the other types of programs that we have.
Okay. All right, other questions, anyone? No. Okay, Steve, I was waiting for you to put your hand up.
It must be telepathic. I would just like to go back to the beginning and figure out where we stand now that I understand a lot more than I did an hour or so ago. So we stand at a proposed 4.36 increase in our assessment. And I think I understood your goal of getting the 3.5 was not going to happen. And there are several things that can happen to get us closer to the 3.5, but none of those are firmed up yet and won't be until Thursday. Am I summarizing the meeting okay so far?
Yeah, Steve, I think that's a great summary of it. I think, in all honesty, I think some of that is also pending discussions with ALG and trying to sort through, kind of the big picture of the total community budget too. I think, we're really...
I'm sitting here looking at the ALG plan, Peters.
100%. Yeah. I mean, we're looking at, with what the town submitted and what we submitted, we're looking at a kind of a $1.7 million gap in the ALG plan from revenue to expense. So, I know, our leadership at the district had a great meeting with town leadership as well. We're trying to work through that problem, and we're hoping to come back, on Thursday to ALG with kind of at least a preliminary proposal on some ideas of how to close at least a large chunk of that gap, knowing that, we really only have a few weeks here to figure it out. So, I think I've been really happy because, since I got here, John Mangiaretti and his team have just been so collaborative in terms of, working with us to try and sort through challenges as they arise. And, I think we're working in the same direction right now.
Okay, thanks.
Christy, go ahead.
What I think would be valuable for us to understand going forward is it's still not clear how much of the revenue reduction has happened is going to continue going forward. Is part of what we're looking at here that the school has grown beyond the budget, needs have grown beyond the enrollment projections? Is this really time that we need to be doing some other sort of cuts, or is this that we're really just looking at replacement for issues around COVID that when we get back to whatever the new normal is, should be recoverable?
Yeah, if I can jump, maybe I'll jump in first, and then Dave can pick up any pieces where either I misspeak, say something that he doesn't agree with, or he just generally wants to correct. When we've had some conversations about kind of what's driving the budget, because we wanted to understand kind of how to think about the next few years, not just how to look at the current year. One of the couple big drivers of our budget was health insurance this year. And, we're fortunate that we knew early on in the process that we'd get guidance from the Health Insurance Trust that it was going to be a 10% increase. Over time, we've looked at relatively small or even negative increases since I've been here as budget drivers, which are, nice to have. From our preliminary understanding now, I don't think we're looking at permanent 10% increases in health insurance trust. That's probably, this year, maybe next year, who knows if there's a third year of that, but at some point, health insurance rates should be able to normalize themselves a bit and kind of come back to that, 4.5%, 5% increase a year that seems typical. So we think of that as kind of, there's some finite period of time. And for the district, with the size of our budget and number of staff, the difference between a 5 and 10% increase for us is a $500,000 additional cost center. The other big cost center for us in the preliminary budget was having to deal with the community education reserve deficit. Not the reserve. I keep calling it reserve. The revolving account hits that we took, and looking at offloading those costs. We do think that over the next few years, that ComEd budget should be able to normalize itself. I think there's going to be a period of time that we have to be able to think about how to, kind of keep that program afloat while it has the opportunity to normalize. But I also think that that's probably a more temporary situation. So, I think right now the approach we're taking is to think, in terms of like, what could the next 2 to 3 years look like? And how do we use funds over the next few years to kind of keep our programs stable? And, we certainly also understand that, circumstances can change during that time. And if we see that it looks like a longer term trend, then we're going to have to think a little bit differently. But what I would hate to do is overreact from an educational services perspective in year one of something that we might think could be a short-term trend. If that, I hope that's a sufficient answer. Dave, I don't know what you'd add.
Well, I could just offer something not as broad, but easy to grasp, and that is the few sources of revenue outside of the assessment are going to be very unlikely to generate any kind of growth for the next couple of years. When I first came in, my predecessor had notoriously conservatively projected revenues in the budget. We not only caught up, but we lapped the field because just in one thing alone, interest income, we had really healthy revenue from earnings on investments up until the pandemic. The good news is that we placed a 30-year bond with equally small rates of interest. So in the big picture, the taxpayers made out because they were going to pay for they were going to pay the interest on those bonds, whether it was 2% or 4%. But the as a source of revenue, we can't count on interest income yet, where we can't count on Chapter 70 significantly yet. Regional transportation reimbursement for the last couple of years, the reimbursement rate was increased without much warning to about they can't go above 100%, and we're very close to 100%. So the opportunities for revenue growth are going to be very slim for the next couple of years, unless the foundation budget mechanics turns around to the point where it does benefit us. But that gets back to how many kids are going to school in Acton and Boxborough and not continuing a decline.
Could I try summarizing what I heard? My understanding is that the gap that we're looking to fill here is not so much, let me back up a second. If you would ask for more ARPA funding or to get more of the town's ARPA funding, it would be to hold steady with the cuts you're already proposing, and then in a year see how things are going. So it's not cut to the bone and then find out things are better than we thought they were and have to build it back up. But it's decrease some and then reassess. So we're looking for the money to be able to do.
I would say that analysis, Christy, is accurate, but it's even independent of ARPA funding, additional ARPA funding, because it's kind of the overall strategy right now is, all right, we recognize that we have shrinking enrollment, and we can be responsive to that and think about what's the right size district for the student enrollment we have. But simultaneously also kind of take the view of we're coming out of a pandemic. Let's not, let's use available resources to kind of soften the descent to the extent we can.
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, based on the ongoing decline in student population and the uncertainty of community ed revenue, as well as the long-term impact of COVID-19, it's obvious that some of these budget issues are going to linger through the next several years. And I would hope, or I'm assuming, that next year's budget, we shouldn't be seeing a big increase, and even maybe a flat rate based on the fact that the student population growth would be negative or flat. And there's population issues as well as the COVID issues, how it disrupts the revenue stream of every single program. Are you developing in the back of your head maybe a buyout program for some of the older teachers? And so it's like almost 80% of your budget is salary and wages. There's not a lot of growth not a lot of room for anything else since that takes such a big piece of our pie. One strategy would be to replace some of the more expensive, experienced teachers, which would be painful, obviously, and substitute some newer, less expensive teachers in this course.
Mike, I'll let Marie talk to that a little bit, but I can also, the only thing I would add to that is staffing has been one of the biggest challenges for us in the last year in trying to get people to work. It's a real challenge. I mean, we've had so many vacancies over the course of this year that we just can't fill in a timely fashion, and that includes teaching positions. I think all options should be on the table with thinking about how we can save some money. But I also want to make sure we do it in a way that we can ensure that we get the staff we need. So Marie, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so I'll add, the state teachers pension system, which is paid for by the employee and the state, not by local, is a pretty big incentive to retire
Oh, Maria, we lost you.
We've done locally. We did have a local retirement incentive, which we actually sunsetted out, and it just ended last year. And I think, honestly, with a lot of encouragement from the finance committee to sort of move that out. And so that has helped our budget. But I think the teachers' retirement system is the biggest incentive out there. And so teachers do retire relatively early. So I think that's already there, and we built that into our budget up front when we have a deadline for letting us know people are going to retire in December so that it can be reflected in our budget. So I think in general that's there. And I'm not sure having anything more locally would be beneficial.
Okay. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, Marie, what's the total FTE count now for the region?
Yeah, we're around 1,000, but we will have on February 17th, we'll have a detailed FTE presentation that will show exactly where we are.
That's good. And how many vacancies do you think you have now?
Yeah, that's another good question. We don't have many teaching vacancies. We have vacancies in bus drivers and cafeteria and support staff. But I'll try to figure that out before the budget. But some of this year's surplus will be due to vacancies, more than we've ever had in terms of vacancies.
I do think we only have a few teaching vacancies, though.
Yeah, if any,
Right now.
yeah,
Yeah.
couple.
I truly wish that education costs were variable with student enrollment, but my close observation of school budgets over the last 15 or 16 years says they're not. So declining enrollment's fine, but it does not result in proportionate decline in budgets.
Jason, go ahead.
Marie, I'm sure you're sick of this question from me asking it year after year after year, but in preparation for Budget Saturday on a Tuesday or Thursday, Budget Saturday on a Thursday, please do come to the meeting with the subscription rate of the open positions. How many people applied for an open teaching position? How many people applied for a special education position? How many people applied for a bus driver position? So the subscription rate, and by all means, you are welcome to say, and of those X number of people that applied, only 50%, 80%, 20% were qualified. But please do come with the oversubscription numbers for each of the positions. That's something that I've been asking for year over year.
Thanks, Jason.
Okay, so if you get down to 3.5%, there's still an ALG gap, right, of 1.6 million between school, town, and that will have to be decided. But at this point, you're still negotiating with the school committee and revising your budget to try to get down to 3.5%. In the most recent meeting, there was pushback by public and by the school committee about all-day K and about special ed and about where the DEIC position lands, which leads me to ask: are there other savings you're looking for, other cuts you're looking for, or are you looking for other funding sources just to get down to 3.5%?
Go ahead,
I know
Dave.
Peter's going to finish, but can I just make sure we don't have a misunderstanding?
Yeah.
The school committee sets the budget, will vote the budget. I don't think it's appropriate to say that the school committee is aiming at 3.5%. The school committee has been presented with the details of where we are now, which happens to be 3.7, which happens to be 4.36 for the Acton assessment. But my understanding is that the school committee is not does not have its agenda to get down to 3.5%.
That's important. Thank you.
Yeah, and Dave, can you? I just want to make sure I'm understanding history here because we've made a lot of changes over the last few weeks. When we had because we were targeting originally 3.5, but there was an assessment number associated with that. Didn't we end up at some point where the budget number came in at like 3.69, but the assessment actually ended up holding because it was a function of how we applied reserves?
Well, when we went through the initial budget cuts, the $1.8 million that we've talked about, that was internally for us to get down to 3.5%. And unfortunately, it wasn't until after we said, aha, we got there, that I realized that 185 of the cuts was actually E&D. And so it was not down to 3.5, it was down to 3.69.
Right. So it was one of those things where, mechanically the assessment stayed the same, but you saw a budget rise just because E&D got applied after the budget.
Right.
So that may be where the confusion around 3.5% came from, because it was our original target. I think, we proposed a couple options. I think all-day kindergarten is the biggest question mark for us right now. We have worked on funding, that the special education position, incorporating that into the budget. So we'll go to school committee this week with that position in there and show kind of what we reduced to get there. It was not staffing, but we looked at some other cost centers to be able to get there. All-day kindergarten, we proposed two options to school committee. I know reducing tuition was a high priority, and there was a lot of community feedback around that, pushing for it. One was kind of a 3-year option that did use a combination of ARPA and reserves to be able to reduce tuition to $1,800 for 3 years and then eliminate it. The other option we did was a much faster decline to 0, which increases the use of ARPA, but it also simultaneously requires budget reductions for the following fiscal year, so that we end up paying for more of the all-day K program initially, but then we use ARPA to offset the cost over a couple of years while we incorporate the rest of the money. That was the piece that we have to go back to school committee with, because there are staffing reductions associated with that. So we're going to show that on Thursday, and kind of keep that discussion going. I don't know if it will get resolved Thursday or if that's going to have to be, resolved kind of as we go through the next steps in the budget, which includes the discussion with ALG. It would be nice to get something resolved from our standpoint, because we have budget binders to prepare and kind of get things ready to go. But on the flip side, we don't want to push the committee to make too many decisions that are dependent on each other in independent settings.
Okay. Adam, go ahead.
Thank you. I find myself apologizing a lot before I ask questions, but I'm still a fairly new FinCom member. But I just want to make sure that I understand the process correct. What Dave said is that it is the school committee that decides the budget and not the three of you or the administration. Is that correct?
Yes, in a nutshell. So what happens is the school committee starts the process by developing guidelines that they want us to be thinking about as we develop proposals for the budget. We then develop what we call the superintendent's preliminary budget, which is kind of a high-level perspective, and then we move that toward a recommended budget by getting feedback from the committee. Over the course of that feedback, the budget evolves, and then eventually the school committee has to vote to adopt that budget as the school district budget. Once the budget that the school committee votes becomes the committee's budget to then bring to the towns.
So as a hypothetical, if you and David and Marie decided this year that the school budget, just using a round number, $100 million is the correct budget, is it possible that the school committee could then come in and say, yeah, we don't think you can do it on $1 million. We're going to vote for a $110 million budget. Is that a likely scenario? Is that something that happens, or is it typically the other way around where they're asking you to make cuts to the budget?
What
I don't. Go ahead, Dave.
what we do is present to them the information that gives them a basis for them to coalesce around the final budget number. Marie and Peter and I don't say this is what the budget ought to be. This is a summary of the requests. These are additional drivers that have been identified as very high priorities and ought to be considered. And then in this year's case, recognizing that we had missed the target by a significant amount, we propose some cuts. But it's all very open and transparent, so that the school committee can look at individual items and say collectively, yes, we're okay with that. No, we don't want that. And by the way, this thing that you didn't even mention, we want that in or out as well.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I can add a little bit to that, as can I'm sure other people, but the school committee definitely is the authority that votes our budget before both Acton and Boxborough town meetings have the ultimate authority. The school committee will listen to all the information, and I have hardly ever seen them.
You cut out, Marie, and I really want to know what you were saying.
Right when you're making your point, you cut out.
I am sorry. I've hardly ever seen them raise the level. But they're both responsible to their respective towns, right? So whatever budget they vote has to fit within the revenues available in their respective towns. So they are part of ALG and the Boxborough Leadership Forum, and they need to make sure it all balances out. But we are definitely not the budget voters. We are the people who provide the information, so school committee and then town meeting can vote.
And I will just add that I hope that if we splurge and buy Marie a new computer, you see that as a necessary addition to the budget. Or at least a microphone.
At least.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, so I want to take a crack at this. And I'm going to take two quick anecdotes, and I want to make a crack at this. The first anecdote is that at the federal level, the president always makes a recommendation for what to give to the DoD, and Congress shockingly always comes back and gives more than what the president asks for. That, I believe, Mr. Nolde, is the scenario that you're talking about here, where the administration makes a recommendation and the entity that is truly responsible for the appropriation overcommits. The second anecdote, the very first year I was on the finance committee, I was assigned as the liaison to the school committee, where a school committee member said something that I think not only shocked me, but put an extremely fine point on the difference between the FinCom role and the school committee role. And that school committee member said was, we decide what's right, and we present a bill to the town. The problem with that approach, which I think Mr. Vertolino was dangerously close to echoing here, is that the town is hamstrung severely by Prop 2.5. So where the administration, as represented by Superintendent Light, Director Vertolino, and Deputy Superintendent Altieri, the fine line they're trying to walk here is they're trying to present a budget that can be approved by the ABRSC while still not blowing past the statutory and inviolable limits of Prop 2.5. So while I respect what Mr. Vertolino said about how these proposals have not been approved by ABRSC and could therefore be changed, it is also extremely important for the members of the ABRSC, if they ever happen to watch this rebroadcast, that if they say, no, we want this and we want that and we want this other thing, if it goes beyond what could possibly be raised through an assessment, then respectfully, all hell breaks loose. Because now we have a situation where the assessment, which is their sole right to issue, cannot be met by the towns that have received the assessment. So hard choices need to be made here if there is a 1.5, 1.7, or dare I say $5.6 million disconnect between wants and capabilities. So I respect the fine line that the three members here tonight have to walk. And I respect what Mr. Vertolino said about it's the ABRSC's final decision. But please, by all means, take my warning back that this is not the year that they want to send an assessment that violates our ability to raise revenues. Is that clear?
Heard you. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions for the school folks who have come to explain what is happening with their budget and their budget drivers? No, I see no other hands. So we're going to continue a discussion amongst ourselves. But I really appreciate you all taking your evening, taking your time, and being here and answering our questions. And I wish you lots of luck with the rest of figuring this budget out, and wish us luck with figuring out how we're going to pay for it.
No, thank you very much. I really appreciate, working with you all, at least for the 4 years I've been here. It's been a good relationship. Our goal is to be transparent, and, we want to provide a really high quality education for our kids that's also a value for our community. So I really appreciate your time, input, and, look forward to the rest of the process with you.
Excellent. Thank you
you.
very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay. So now we have a lot of information. We still don't have, obviously, the final number that the school is going to present, but we can guarantee that it's not going to be lower than 3.5%, 3.6%. So we still have a large gap. Anybody have some death in the family inheritance that they want to offer up, or other creative problem solving techniques, or places where you think we need to be considering pushing back on budgets? Thoughts? Christy.
To point it at this a different way. Sorry, I can't speak tonight. There's Steve can give us the exact number. There's a $1.7 million-ish gap in the ALG plan right now. And boy, as much as I wish it would happen, the school's not going to cut that much from their budget in addition. So we're going to have to figure out, what I heard from the last ALG meeting was a desire on the part of the school committee to come back to the town and ask for more ARPA funds to help fill that.
I'm not getting that from the conversation we just had at all.
No. I said school committee. And that was based on the last ALG meeting. That's what I heard at the ALG meeting.
You're right. I did hear that, but I think that they were maybe even misunderstanding, because it sounds like they still have ARPA funds that they can tap that have already been allocated to them.
Yeah, I was a little unclear. I should have asked about where that money was in their budget. And I just want to clarify what I heard from what Jason said, which was it's too late for them to ask for an override at this point. So if they come and ask for us for the budget size they have without finding another revenue source such as ARPA funds, we can't pay for it at this point. Am I correct on those?
Well, we're unwilling to reduce reserves in order to cover that gap. It would maybe be a more correct statement.
And or it would require a greater cut on the town side than the town side is willing to kick in.
And the ALG plan, I believe, uses all of the free cash that we have in our policy.
I think it uses almost all, but not all. There might be a little left, but go ahead, Steve. You have that number?
I think it calls for using $1 million. Technically, you could use $1 million and still stay above the 3% threshold.
And I apologize for not having looked at this recently, but does it touch the untaxed levy capacity? I think that was
Yes.
another 400K.
Yes, so it's gone.
It uses it.
Okay.
So
And I'll just make a comment as far as the 3% floor, that this isn't the year to maybe fix or address it. From that conversation and what I heard as far as revenue replacement of the school's free cash, is that they're not yet running their free cash use the way we asked, and the town went ahead and started, rather than pre-using based on assumed returns, the town backed off to using returns that came in the previous year.
Mhm.
And I don't think the school is doing that yet, just based on the way they just talked about their free cash use. Not something to fix this year. I just wanted to clarify that. Go ahead, Adam.
So one of the things that's got me concerned, and this is a little bit to do with the graphs I sent out earlier. The graphs don't include anything about the FTEs for either the town or the school. But when Marie mentioned that their current FTEs are at 1,000, and I do have some of their FTE data, but I don't have all of it for the last 5 years. I'm concerned that, let me just pull the spreadsheet up. In 2018 fiscal year, they had 757 FTEs. In 19, they had 782. There's a gap of 2 years that I don't have their FTEs, and now we're sitting at 1,000 FTEs. That's a pretty remarkable growth rate for a district that's got declining enrollment, and that really concerns me.
That must be a gap between maybe like you might have the teachers' numbers there, not all staff.
No, that's all staff.
No, what I mean is
2 and 1,000.
they wouldn't have. You went from 750 to 1,000 over a couple of years.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
I don't think
It might help to remember that last year there was another school added.
Right.
And a few years ago, we added a whole bunch of bus drivers.
Yeah, so we really need their FTE data to get a sense of what's been happening with their employment while the enrollment's been declining. That's a picture that we really need to know. Okay.
Yeah, the enrollment problem is that, you might end up with some classes where you're not at 24 kids sitting in the classroom, but it's not enough to cram all the kids into one fewer, teacher teaching space. So as Steve said, enrollment can go down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that costs and budgets are going to go down.
Sure. Yeah, no, I get that. But I think there's a certain amount of prudence in your budgetary process. When we look at the enrollment for the school, it's down 10% over 15 years, and it's down just under 5% for just over 4, just under 5% for the period 2015 to 2020. It really hasn't shown any growth in that 15-year period. And so, I think prudence requires that the people in charge of the budgetary process would be taking that into account and really paring back and planning for, thinner, leaner times. But I don't get the impression that has happened. That's, I think, what's got me worried.
Okay, go ahead, Jason, and then Steve.
I agree with Adam. I would definitely like to do a side-by-side comparison of FTE to understand which taxing entity is growing faster, et cetera. But at the same time, I definitely want to give both sides an opportunity to explain where the growth is. For example, on the school side, I'm curious how many of those positions are the assistant classroom staff that was formerly paid by the PTSOs, Douglas After Dark, and I can't remember what which school had the preschool before school hours program. But that's a significant number of people that the school committee decided to take on. I think only 2 years ago.
And now they're being cut.
Maybe it was 3 years ago. COVID times, it's crazy. But you know what are those numbers? What those numbers really are. So I think it's absolutely. I agree with Mr. Nolde. We absolutely need to have a good scrub of FTE, because as we all know, the FTE is the single greatest driver of the budget on both taxing entity side.
Well, and if I can add to that, Jason, that, you know, it's obvious. I think none of us are naive enough to believe that school enrollment is a specific driver of the school's budget. However, I would make the argument that school enrollment should be a very highly correlative driver of FTEs, period, end of story. I think that that's my opinion. And I believe that in reality, that should bear out. You know, maybe we'd have to do some research on other districts or national, you know, averages on districts or something like that. But it just, to me, makes sense that enrollment would drive FTEs.
I would say that that's a trailing indicator, and that there, as with anything else, employment rated, it relies upon a range. So, you know, we also need to have part and parcel of this is we need to have a conversation about average classroom size, and making sure that we are not significantly, you know, 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the DESE recommended average classroom size.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to raise a couple of those points. One, the classroom assistants were never in the appropriated budget years ago, but they were funded by the PTSOs. And the other thing is, if you go back 10 years, our average class size was much higher than our, I guess, comparable school districts. I don't think we're ever quite out of line with the state average, but in compared to the school systems that we like to think are comparable, we were way higher in terms of average class size. In terms of the stickiness of school budgets, enrollment can look like it's going down, but what drives a school budget is sections. How many classrooms of first graders, second graders, third graders do we need? Because the FTEs are more geared to the number of sections. You need a teacher, you need an assistant in each classroom. If you had a 5% decrease in enrollment spread out over the entire system, that's 1 kid per section.
Right.
It doesn't do a thing for your costs. In fact, you know, you need a significant drop in enrollment before you can redeploy sections. And again, it comes down to building costs. You need a very significant drop before you can start talking about getting rid of a building. So the costs are very sticky going down. They slide up because of salary increases and benefit increases every year, even when enrollment is pretty flat.
Which we should all be concerned about.
And that's, you know, the longer term concern is the problem we're looking at this year is not going to improve next year. I think our approach to this probably should be something like, see what other revenue sources we can scrub around and find, see what cuts select board and the school committee can be able to make. But hold the line on our 3% free cash and policy, because it's not going to be better next year. If we tap out this year, it's, it just gets worse next year. And beyond that, I believe it was back in October, I may have mentioned something about an override this year, because I didn't see the numbers ever working. And pretty much Peter Light said the same thing. So we had our opportunity for an override discussion, and it was not picked up. So now we're pretty much in a cutting mode. I'm not saying there aren't puddles of money that we could tap, and I know where a lot of them are, but there are hundreds of thousands, not millions. So there's some cutting that's going to happen.
Go ahead, Christy.
I just want to educate or clarify something for Adam. There is going to be less of a direct correlation between enrollment and cost, in part because the type of students we get coming in, we have a number of unfunded mandates specifically around special education and English language learners who both require more resources than other kinds of students. So if you're getting a shift towards those populations, which I believe we've had in the last few years, you will see a need for more FTEs, even if you're having a decline in enrollment.
Okay. So we have an ALG meeting on Thursday. And possibly a school committee meeting we could speak at Thursday night, just to offer our 2 cents and make it clear that even if they do the cuts that they don't want to make, we're still not at a number that we know how to fund. The town was also hit with a $1 million, sorry, not a $1 million, 10% HIT health insurance trust number. Is the town had more percentage of budget resources for revenue replacement and not revenue replacement, I mean revenue replacement, but also COVID costs than the school has? And maybe I should have asked that when they were on, but I know that as a regional school district, we sometimes don't get as much reimbursement as we would if we were not a regional school district. So I'm wondering if the town has had more opportunity to use outside funding to cover some of the hits, so that all they're left with in the end is, health insurance trust, whereas the school has more uncovered expenses by the nature of their district. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Way back when, there was some discussion about whether some of the inflated health insurance trust costs this year, which we had a number for, it was a few $100,000, I think, that were direct COVID impacts. And the answer that we got both from, I think, the town manager, and I think Dave Perlino also concurred, that the health insurance trust for some reason was not eligible to get COVID relief, even though we were the ones paying the COVID costs on the part of the employees. So to the extent that the school is, because they're 2/3 of the trust, were more impacted than the town, by COVID, unreimbursed COVID costs, that's an example.
Okay. Christy, go ahead.
The schools were also, I believe they got their own CARES. I'm looking at my notes from ALG last year. I believe they had their own CARES allocation. I'm not sure about that. They did get some ESSER money, which the town does not have access to. And then that helped pay for some of the fiscal year 22 budget, COVID things.
Okay. Go ahead, Adam, and then Steve. Go ahead, Adam.
So, Christine, before Thursday's ALG, I'd really like to get from our committee their opinion on how much free cash we should recommend using for this and whether it should be doled out as like a 2/3, 1/3 percentage type situation. If you disagree with trying to get that information before Thursday morning, you can stop it now, but I just wanted to throw that out there. That's something I really want. Would like to have the opinion or consensus of the FinCom on.
Steve.
I was just going to give you that. So, like I said, the current ALG plan uses $1 million worth of free cash. By my rough calculation, we could go down to using 1.4 million and still stay within the 3% threshold. I don't want to go all the way to 1.4. I am concerned about settling collective bargaining agreements in FY23 that wind up being higher than what we've got provided for in the town manager's budget, and then if we go to the absolute floor on free cash for the appropriated budget, we won't have any way to fund those during FY23 because we're going to have to wait for another year's maybe turnbacks to see if we get any more free cash. So I don't want, use 1.2, 1.3, but not all 1.4. You can ask poor Brian McMullen to check out the overlay reserve one more time. You can, like I said, I think the untaxed levy capacity is already being assumed in the budget. But as I look at the fiscal 24 and 25, things don't improve. Things are probably even worse because I suspect our collective bargaining agreements are going to be settled at more than 2.5%. So I don't think this is a year where you can say, well, let's do everything but cut personnel because it'll be better next year. It's not going to be better next year. So some reconciliation of headcount to our revenue model needs to be made. They might as well start now.
Are you directing that thought more towards the schools, the town, both?
Well, schools are in a position where they're talking about cutting. However, the town is talking about adding. It's not a good look for town meeting. I'll say that just from a pure political standpoint. Especially if, the town wants to add a diversity and inclusion person in the school, cuts one. What's the message we're sending?
So Acton town meeting did vote for that diversity and equity and inclusion position, and so did the select board. So that's definitely going to, be taken into consideration. And the switch from a assistant superintendent to a director position, in theory, should be a more focused position, but it's not a lot of savings. But I don't think they're going to cut that position completely.
Well, my point is, so the town has what, 300 employees? I think the school has
Jason says
1,000.
400.
Yeah.
400.
Yeah. So who needs one? Who doesn't?
Actually, we should ask the select board member, or Mr. Barrett, what is the current FTE of the municipal side?
That's
Rather than
about
me saying
200.
400.
It's about 215, 220, Jason. Active staff, not retirees.
Oh,
Okay. So
Excellent.
that's not okay.
Mike, go ahead. You're muted, Mike. We can't hear you.
Yeah, they were very vague on coming up with specific numbers about the population, about the decline, about special ed, about the teachers. I think it's very clear that their problem this year is not all that unique for the year ahead or even 2 years ahead. So I think the budget that they prepare has to reflect or should reflect at least a stab of next year's budget and the year after that. And it should also reflect that the trend in the decline in student population must have an impact on their budget, or budget increases would not be justified if you see the student population declining. So it obviously has an impact on the size of the classes and so on. And I think they really need to start thinking about like a buyout for some of the more experienced teachers that are ready to retire. Give them a little extra incentive, and that, as I said, as we all know, 79% of their budget is salary and overhead. If somehow we can cut into that percentage just a bit, it would really represent significant savings or free up dollars to do something else with, something more productive. So I think they should incorporate budget cuts in the future.
I will point out that they did recommend 14 FTEs in their initial proposed potential cuts to the budget. But that, again, only gets them down to 3.67, which is still above. Yeah, Christy. Oh,
And that's 3.67 of total budget increase, not our request for 3.5 of assessment.
Right.
We're still looking at, I think it was a 4.7% assessment, which is the real problem for us.
4.36 at the moment, right?
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead, Christy. Unmute, Christy.
I would like to remind the school committee, et cetera, that not only is this a hard time for them, but it's a hard time for everyone with record inflation, et cetera. We're once again hearing people, at least on Nextdoor, shocked about their increases in tax bills. And this is not a problem limited to the schools. I would also like to hear a broader opinion of what Steve said about it looking bad for the town to be adding positions while the school is cutting. Given that the town has been more conservative about positions in the last few years, they've left a number of positions open, not backfilled things. I understand the optics on one hand, but on the other hand, it feels like the town is getting hit a little on having been responsible.
Would you all like me to put up this chart for this discussion?
Sure.
So let's see here.
Give it a whirl, Adam.
See if I can share my screen since I went through all the trouble of installing this on my computer. Let's see. Where is the share screen button?
It should kind of show up in
share
green.
screen. Okay. So does that show you or no?
No.
You probably have to do it from the other login.
Does that
Yep.
show you?
Yeah, it's starting to. Yep, we got it.
Okay. So one thing that's not on here, and maybe it's fair to discuss it, maybe it's not, but with regard to FTEs, Mr. Barrett was very kind to help me get the information to put this chart together. And the municipal side's FTE growth over the period of this chart is about 4%, which is in lockstep with the population growth at 3.7%. So that's a piece of information that's not in this chart that I know that all of you will find very interesting. And with it up there, have at it. Talk about what you see or what concerns you or what looks good to you, makes you feel different about maybe a perception you had previously. Or if you need any explanations, I can explain things.
Roland has his hand up, I think.
Oh,
Can you
thank
hear
you. Go ahead, Roland.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so looking at Adam's chart right here, it says muni growth at 15% and the population growth of 3.7, which is showing a delta of what, 11.3.
Well, and then from the school side, you have a negative enrollment growth and an assessment growth of 23%.
Right. Within the town, it's not really lockstep, is what you were saying, that of three and 4, you'll see a municipal growth of 15%.
That's the municipal budget growth, Roland, and he was saying that the FTE growth matches the population growth.
Yeah, where is the FTE growth on this chart? I guess it's
not.
I didn't put it on because I don't have the FTE growth for the school.
Okay.
So maybe
so
I'm not being fair by mentioning it, but
that's what my confusion was. Sorry. The other thing is, as Christy has pointed out, the last couple of years, the town has been very cautious and has not backfilled some positions. So we need to take that into account too. We're looking at that. So.
Yeah, so for the last 5 years is tough because for the last couple of years, the town's COVID response led naturally to don't backfill. Whereas the schools had to run an entire separate online school with its own superintendent and principal and some AB teachers moved into that school and there was some outside hiring of teachers that they then didn't keep on. So the last couple of years are fuzzy as a comparison for these two.
Right, and they're also absent from this chart as well. Since we stop at the end of fiscal year 20, we stop at just the beginning of the COVID situation. So there's very little of the COVID impact in this chart.
Okay, all right, good, thank you. Okay.
One other thing I have is that, when Steve was just talking about 1.2, I'm more comfortable with 1.1, even a little bit more of the floor, so because of uncivil contract.
Also, Madam Chair.
Sure, real quick, and then I'm going to go to the people with their hands up. Go ahead.
It's also a case of you have to pay attention to which year you start with. Going back to 2014, 2015, yeah, that's definitely instructive and a worthwhile year to start with. But at the same time, if you look, the bulk of the growth on the school side is in the first year, whereas the bulk of the growth on the municipal side is in the later years. So it's important that you pay attention to which year you start with the growth, right? So it's, in some ways, it's dangerous to look at only a 5-year chart.
Yeah. And I wish we could look at more. Unfortunately, the 10-year data I have, everything prior to 2015 includes Acton Public School, which I could not get any data for.
Which is going to be a problem for the next handful of years until APS absolutely recedes into the rearview mirror.
Mhm.
But I do just want to point that out, that the growth charts are parabolic. They're not. It's not like one grew faster than the other in every year.
Right. Okay. Go ahead, Isha.
So again, as one of the newest FinCom members, I guess I need a little bit of a schooling on the history. Does anybody have an idea what the drivers for that assessment growth in the school district was or were?
If I remember correctly, no, I haven't been on that long. I do not. I'm gonna need some older voices if anybody knows.
Thank you.
Mr. Noon sticks his hand up.
Don't like to be considered an older voice.
I
More
didn't say
experienced.
old.
I was not at all happy at Jason's comment about some of us whose kids haven't been in the school system may not recall these details. My mental acuity has not fallen off that fast, even though my youngest graduated in 2006. So the problem with assessments started with regionalization. Even though it was portrayed at the time to be a great thing and would have massive cost savings, it did not. The first year of regionalization, our assessment went up by 7%. So they got off to a bang. For 5 years after regionalization, Boxborough was kind of subsidizing us a bit. There was a cost shift away from Acton towards Boxborough. It got less and less every year, but it kept adding to the growth of the Acton assessment, as did enrollment. Only very recently has enrollment in Boxborough started to grow again for quite some time. They were lagging behind us, and then we got like the Avalon community built, and a few other things, and so every possible thing that could go wrong in terms of assessment on the Acton side seemed to go wrong since regionalization. I do expect it'll stabilize now. I mean, the cost shifting with Boxborough is long gone. I think there is more growth in Boxborough than there has been in a few years. So I expect our relative assessment is probably going to level off. The problem is the assessment is just how we break up the budget, and the budget keeps growing. And this year, the FY23 teacher's contract calls for a 2.5% COLA increase and roughly a 2.5% increase in steps and lanes, so 5% in total. So are they having a problem with their budget for 23? Yes, they are. But that was done 3 years ago. The 10% increase in health insurance is mostly COVID related. The way the medical costs are going, we're not seeing more utilization. People aren't going to the doctor more often. They're not having more surgeries or procedures done, but every one that is done costs quite a bit more. So there's not a lot we can do about the health insurance. And if you look at that whole period of time, yeah, there were a couple of years when there was no increase in health insurance costs. So averaging them out, the 10% is obviously an eye-catching number this year. But if you average it out over all those years, it was probably like 5% overall. So it's a driver this year. It's not a driver for the long term. And I don't expect it will continue to be the driver that it is this year. But that's kind of I took more than 30-second view of assessment growth.
Thanks, Steve.
Christy?
Steve, one point, the increase of insurance, as I understand it, should have been pretty obvious. I believe that the reduction was because of a switch to high deductible plans, and if that's the case, the case, it would stop. I mean, there's only so much that people are going to change in this same time period. I sure haven't seen any 0% or decreases. It's been a pretty steady 5% over that same period of time for us in healthcare costs.
The health insurance trust, probably 5 years ago, was sitting on what could only be termed excessive reserves. And so there was a concerted effort to hold rates down until those reserves were brought more in line with industry standards. We have succeeded beyond our wildest imagination to get our reserves down. And so now we will basically be riding the healthcare cost curve. We have no more ability to stabilize what's going on.
Hindsight, this should have been apparent that something like this was coming, correct?
Oh, yeah. We made the call very, very early this year. Typically, we would not have made a call on health insurance rates until about December, when we usually would make.
Mike, your hand's up. Do you have a question or comment? You're muted. I can't hear you. We can't hear you, Mike.
Yeah, the question is, how long ago did they know they had this problem? Or that their potential problem? Like a quarter, 2 quarters ago?
Yeah, it sounds like they knew in the fall that it was likely.
Yeah.
And we're just finding out now. So you think there's a communication issue between FinCom and the schools?
I wonder if, newer superintendent to the ALG scenario, newer town manager to the ALG scenario. I don't know if override's even on their radar or the process for override is on their radar. But this is the fairly typical budget presentation process. And we still have time to debate. And
just a question: Do they present to us on a quarterly basis?
The schools do not. No, I mean, not really.
Maybe they should.
Yeah, they make quarterly presentations to the school committee.
At the end of the year, how are we supposed to muster resources to help solve their problem if they had a whole year to work on it, and we just have weeks, days? It makes no sense.
They used to present mostly because I think it was a bylaw of the town, but the town bylaw only really ever covered APS, K through 6. So when they would come in to talk about K through 6, they'd talk about 7 through 12 as well. But once regionalization happened, then that town bylaw went away. It still applies to the town, and Steve Barry or Brian or somebody comes in once a quarter and gives us an update. But this year's budget wasn't it wasn't a mystery. You only needed to know two things, and I'm pretty sure I did mention them back in October because I have an Excel spreadsheet that I created in October trying to show the impact of a 10% increase in health and a 5% teacher's contract and how that would have been more money that we could raise. So I think it's been obvious for a while. I do think over the years, the early meetings of ALG used to be very much centered around that issue. Is there going to be an override this year? But it has been so long since we had to face that issue. I think it's just not something that anybody wants to talk about in October anymore. And then you do kind of get we just started the budget process. Let's see where they come out. Well, you can pretty much tell early on they weren't going to come out in a good place this year.
Just playing the devil's advocate.
Yeah, I'm saying if you really wanted to think about it, you could have figured this one out in October or November. And I think a lot of people did. The question is, why didn't they say anything?
Yeah, it's a surprise, but not a surprise.
Yeah.
You think a high level is sort of a whiteboard exercise to figure out if sometime in the future, especially with regard to declining populations that could go on for quite a while, that we de-regionalize partially?
I don't think that'll ever happen. I do think that the school committee does have a need to probably do a pretty thorough review of what's the right size school system for the school population they're dealing with. It's less incumbent upon the town to do so. The town's population is growing, and if most of your metrics on the key positions in the town, police and fire, are kind of per 1,000 people metrics. So many police officers per 1,000 population, so many firemen per 1,000 population, and we tend to be in line with those. So as the population grows, you can make a case. And this is probably how we should handle it at a town meeting to avoid the optics that I mentioned before. It's different demographics. Town population is growing. The needs of that population for town services is growing. School population is declining. But knowing why most of the people in this town ever moved to this town, it's still bad optics.
Okay, it's getting late, so I'd like to wrap this up. Christy, did you want to comment real quick? Okay. So I think what Adam and I are hearing is we want to see cuts. We don't see these combined budgets as sustainable. The biggest budget clearly being the school budget, that we'd like them to go back and look for more savings opportunities. That even 3.5% is a number that we're finding it challenging to cover. So do we have a similar feeling about the town side?
It's like moving the deck chairs on a Titanic.
Yeah.
It's not going to make much of a difference. Or
yeah. Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
I don't have concrete numbers to share with you. But I would say as you go into this conversation on Thursday morning at LG, I don't believe that this is as simple as we've got a X $100,000 hole to fill. Schools need to pony up 2/3, town needs to pony up 1/3. I believe that the optics that Steve spoke of, and he's being polite about it, and actually, let me take just 10 seconds to say that an assertion I made in our last meeting was wrong. I had erroneously read 2 of the positions that were requested in ARPA. The positions sounded very similar to positions that were currently or recently filled, and I did inaccurately, and I was wrong, make an assertion that ARPA had been used to fill 2 positions. So given that I was wrong on that, let me be very clear that as we move forward, and also granted that the new positions the town is looking to fill are funded, all except for one, are funded through revolving funds and through grants. It is absolutely bad optics for the town to be hiring people without clear termination dates of the contracts while the school is laying people off, while the school side is laying people off. I would also say that in the past, it's been the practice that if there's an X $100,000 problem, the schools pick up 2/3 of the cuts, the town pick up the other third of the cuts. I don't think that's appropriate this year, because I don't think that the revenue sources that have come to the town have been shared on a 2/3, 1/3 basis. While I am not impressed by the ARPA statements that were brought forward by the school district tonight, in fact, I'm actively baffled by the ARPA requests brought forward by the school district tonight. I do not believe it is anywhere near fair to say that the ARPA allocation is in line with our traditional norms. So my advice to you, Madam Chair, and to Mr. Vice Chair Nolde is that this is not a typical 2/3, 1/3 year. While I was wrong on the 2 hires in ARPA, after a nice close conversation with my select board counterpart, I still do contend that there are wants in the ARPA requests instead of needs. So when you go back on ALG on Thursday morning, we have a hole to fill, and I'm not at all convinced that it should be filled 2/3 by the school side. I hope that's clear.
I understand. I hear you. Christy.
I pretty significantly disagree with Jason. I think in the last few years and continuing this year, the town has done a very good job operating within our requests for what is a sustainable level, and the school has not. This is the first time I've seen them dropping FTEs rather than adding FTEs and new programs. And I don't think they've been flagrant, but I know that they get a lot of, I'm making an assumption here, apologies. From my experience, the people who pay attention to the school committee meetings who are giving feedback are largely parents. And they're the ones invested in it, but the bill is footed by the entire population. So I have concerns that the decisions to add new programs and FTEs are based on the input of a limited population. I also would like to give credit to the schools in that the way they have funded a lot of those positions is by the early retirement program that just sunsetted, by getting rid of or encouraging more expensive teachers to retire with the benefit of bringing in less expensive teachers. However, there's still growths in FTEs, which means that we have people who we have to keep paying for as they become more experienced with their contracts over time. In short, I think the town has managed their budget very well, and I have concerns ongoing about the growth the schools have taken on in the last few years and how long we can be expected to sustain that coming out of this. I don't want to spend a bunch of one-time ARPA money, even along the split that Jason has, and find out in 2 or 3 years that with the decline in enrollment, it's a real challenge to get there. I appreciate the way the select board has allocated the ARPA money as one-time expenses, especially with Jason's clarification. Thank you for that.
Okay, any other thoughts? Okay, don't be surprised if we reach out individually for clarification on some of the comments that were made tonight. I know that there are members of the audience who have their hands up, and I really appreciate that they've been sticking with us and wanting to talk, but it's late. So we're going to wrap up the meeting, but I strongly encourage you to send us an email so that we can have your thoughts on this discussion. But Mr. Barrett needs to go to bed, and the rest of us also need to complete our evenings. So I will entertain a motion.
I move to adjourn the meeting.
All right, I have a second.
Second.
All right, Adam, you want to do your magic and get us out of here?
Roll the roll. Christine,
Aye.
Roland,
Aye.
Christy,
Aye.
Steve,
Aye.
David,
Aye.
Isha,
Aye.
Mike,
Aye.
Jason,
Nay.
and I will vote aye.
All right, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.
Good night.
Good night.